Hi there, welcome to The Drum. I'm John Barron. Coming up tonight, the big sell is on after last night's federal budget, and Wayne Swan now admits that promising a surplus may not have been the best thing to do, politically at least. The PM in tears today in Parliament as she introduces legislation to pay for disability care. And are we, just possibly, granting refugee status too easily? Our panel tonight, New South Wales Greens MP Cate and Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs, and in Canberra, The Guardian Australia's political editor Lenore Taylor. And you can join us as well on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, Treasurer Wayne Swan has defended his promise of a return to surplus this year, but admits that it may have been politically unwise in retrospect with the budget delivered last night, complete with that deficit of more than $19 billion. The hard sell got underway this morning with a barrage of media appearances from senior figures on both sides of politics. And at lunchtime, the Treasurer fronted the National Press Club in Canberra, where he maintained that it was economically responsible to present a pathway back to surplus, even if he's paying a political price for that now.
Was that politically unwise? I guess you could say yes. Is it politically uncomfortable? I think you can say yes. Was it in policy sense unwise? No, I don't believe so, because showing a clear pathway to surplus has brought enormous benefit to this country, and we're still showing it.
The opposition leader, Tony Abbott, was honing his attack on the government's central claim that a write-down in revenue is to blame for this deficit.
Their principal excuse is that somehow the revenue has collapsed. Wrong. Revenue is up 7% this year. It'll be up 8% next year. The problem is not a revenue problem. The problem is a spending problem. Revenue will be $80 billion more next year than in 2007. Spending will be $120 billion more next year than in 2007. That's why the $20 billion surplus of Peter Costello is the $20 billion deficit of Wayne Swan.
Predictably, perhaps, with relatively few new announcements last night, including the abolition of the baby bonus, it dominated the post-budget coverage today. A number of scribes suggesting that a two-week bonking boom may result from the looming funding cut, which comes into effect in about 9 months and 2 weeks from now. Now, Cate Fairman, first on that baby bonus, a big and obvious cut, I suppose, even though there is some compensation coming around the other way with the family tax benefit A. It's been hard to find anybody defending the baby bonus. Are you in the category that would defend it?
No, we're definitely not in the category that would defend it. We don't agree with it, essentially, so it should have been scrapped. I mean, the big omission for us in this budget, though, was childcare in terms of helping families with young kids, childcare, making childcare places affordable, so there was nothing there. But scrapping the baby bonus was essentially a good thing, but we need to make sure that, of course, our most vulnerable families, like single parents, for example, are funded, and we know that they're actually have been shifted onto New Start. New Start is way too low, below the poverty line, so that's not good either.
But presumably those vulnerable families were also eligible for the baby bonus. It's not just the middle class that may have been, as we hear, perhaps apocryphally spending it on golf clubs and flat-screen TVs, but it was also being spent on what it was intended to do, to pay for the cost of having a newborn in the house.
Well, yes, of course, but they've also had some addition to the family tax benefit, which is a good thing. I mean, you know, they were saying they had to find savings somewhere, but the fact that they didn't look at how childcare could be more affordable. They're not really encouraging people back into the workplace in terms of the New Start allowance, for example. And we know that people who have single parents, the fact that they now can earn an extra, I think it's $19 a week, which is like 1 hour of casual work, is, you know, that's hardly an incentive. So people are still going to be struggling on this. There's just, you know, in terms of families, poorer families, this budget really contained nothing.
Lenore Taylor in Canberra, to you on this, I mean, we saw Joe Hockey being asked straight away last night and all through the day today, yes, but what would the opposition in government do with the baby bonus? And he wouldn't be drawn on it. Was that part of the point of it? Was that deliberate politics to try and flush out the opposition on this policy?
Well spotted, I think it was. I mean, I think the government clearly needed to find the savings, and this was obviously one place that they could go. But it does also throw a bit of a curveball to the coalition, because there are large parts of the coalition, particularly the National Party, that have been, you know, very wedded to the baby bonus as a payment for stay-at-home mothers, who are uncomfortable with the generosity of Tony Abbott's paid parental parental leave scheme as compared with the benefits available to stay-at-home mothers. And so this presents the coalition with a dilemma, because of course they have to find savings too, and the day of reckoning when their costings and their savings will become public isn't that far away. And so they've been absolutely stumm on the matter today. They will not be drawn. And even Warren Truss, the leader of the National Party, I saw interviewed a little while ago, and he wasn't, letting any cats out of the bag about which way they'll go. So I do think it presents the coalition with a pretty interesting dilemma. If I had to guess, Tony Abbott is being pretty rigorous, pretty disciplined in presenting a small target in the lead up to the election. He eventually went along with the increase in the Medicare levy because he didn't want to fight the election about disability reform, which he agrees with in principle, but he'd been saying might be funded over the longer term. So if I had to guess, I reckon they might in the end go along with the cutting of the baby bonus on the grounds that, they don't really want this to be the issue of contention. But I think it is an issue for the coalition that they're grappling with right now.
Tim, do you get the sense, as Lenore suggests, that the opposition will try to stay stumm on a lot of these kinds of issues and just present that small target between now and September?
Well, I agree that they will probably try and present a small target. I don't think that's really in any dispute. The key thing is what they'll do in response to this budget. And I mean, I thought it was quite entertaining that Wayne Swan actually wore a green tie today to go and present to the National Press Club.
What was the significance of that?
Well, I was going to say the significance of Wayne Swan's green tie might be that he's floating back to Neverland, formerly referred to as the Commonwealth Treasury, because this budget puts in these fantasy-based projections in terms of the costs, the likely revenue income for the federal government into the future. And this is a key part of the structural problem. They keep taking on year-on-year expenditure, which continues to perpetuate out in the long term through new large expenditure programs as well as existing ones, while still hoping and praying that they're going to get these massive windfall gains from short-term taxes that go up and down, including one of them being the mining tax, which the Greens are very much in favour of. So they've got a key problem with their budget, which isn't actually going to be solved or addressed. To me, it's just this bizarre product that, you can't really take much of what Wayne Swan has said seriously because it's unlikely to be delivered.
Cate, it seems today that the verdict generally, certainly from the community sector, was, look, it wasn't as bad as it might have been, but still very disappointed that there wasn't an increase in the basic rate of Newstart. Yes, you can earn more before you start losing your allowance, but it's still, what, $50 a week. It's not a lot of money, and if we're not going to increase Newstart now in what were supposed to be good times under a Labor government, when?
Yeah, I mean, people on Newstart are really doing it tough, and particularly about 67,000 parents, I think, who were shifted onto Newstart. And shortly after that, I heard at least one story of a young mother who didn't have accommodation for that night. They were shifted onto Newstart so quickly. It really is below the poverty line. And for the government to not, I mean, they've got these big ticket items like Gonski and disability care, for them not to have put this in as well, it's maybe their attitude about people who are looking for work, providing everybody the incentive. We can't make them too comfortable. Well, they're not even vaguely comfortable. They're struggling to get to job interviews on this amount of money. It hasn't been increased for at least a decade. It's really tough, and it's really disappointing that they didn't do this. It's an opportunity for them to do it. They may not win the next election. It could have even just been a signal to the NGO sector and community groups. Everybody's disappointed they didn't do it.
I think it's a harsher political reality in that. They didn't increase Newstart allowance because the polling said that the public, by and large, wasn't in favour of, particularly in key Western Sydney seats, where there is a concern about whether people are working and whether they're seeking work enough. I think it's a much more brutal political reality than you're painting.
Lenore, is it possible yet to discern after less than 24 hours whether there's sort of a general consensus in? You've got queues of interest groups, shadow ministers outside every studio in Canberra and around the country today. Can you get a sense of how this budget has actually gone down?
I think the big negative for the government is the credibility question, because they put so much political capital on returning to surplus and then had to admit that they couldn't because the forecasts have been wrong in the past. And I mean, forecasts can be wrong, but they had spent most of that revenue in expectation of receiving it. That's a big problem for the government, and I think that's sort of pretty widely conceded. But on the other hand, I would say that everyone is talking today about the disability scheme, about Gonski, about whether or not the government has been responsible in terms of cutting the baby bonus and taking some difficult decisions. I think the strategy was to try and pull the debate onto the issues that the government wants to talk about in the election campaign, disability and Gonski, education, and how they can conceivably fund it, and force the coalition to start talking about what spending cuts they would support or what alternative spending cuts they would make. And I think there's some sign that that strategy might to some extent be working. Of course, it's sort of discounted by that credibility argument that I mentioned in the first instance, but the government is dictating the terms of the debate, and they haven't done that very much at all in this political cycle.
And Lenore, how much resentment are you detecting in the opposition ranks about the fact that these major policies with decade-long funding commitments are being wheeled out at possibly the 11th hour of a government, which the polls suggest is going to be gone in 4 months, and suddenly their hands are being tied. Even if they agree with the policies, they have to find a way to fund them because maybe the numbers don't yet add up.
Well, exactly, and that's what the coalition calls it, a booby trap, or they are very angry about it. On the other hand, the reforms are really popular, and you can see how popular they are by virtue of the fact that the coalition has, in the disability reform space, gone along not just with the reform, which they always supported, but also now pretty much with the government's timing and funding methodology, because it was too risky to buy a fight on the margins about when it should start or how it should be funded, because it would look like they were opposed to the reform. And I think that's precisely how the government wanted to play those issues, and I think to some extent it's working.
Well, we'll have some more on disability care in just a moment. But first, let's have a look at some of the other details that could be found buried in this year's budget papers. Money for all sorts of things, as it turns out. Almost $10 million set aside to teach older people how to use the internet. $188 million for 2 major telescope arrays. $2 million to help fund the Conversation website. And then there's almost $15 billion to help, help fund the 2015 Cricket World Cup. Cricket's not that expensive. But what caught the eyes of our panellists would be interesting to hear. Cate Fairman, in terms of what was in and what was out, what did you see?
Well, in terms of what was out, what we didn't see in there was anything in terms of housing, addressing housing affordability. And I mentioned childcare. In fact, I don't think in the Treasurer's speech he even mentioned housing. There's, I think, 500,000 rental shortages across the country. We know that's a really big issue affecting a lot of young people and not so young people, actually. So that was very disappointing.
Yeah. Anything stand out to you, Tim, either because it was there or it wasn't?
The thing that stood out to me actually was just a little line item, I think it's Department of Arts and the Community and something else, $11 million to fund a national civic education campaign for the local government referendum. And by national civic education campaign, I'm wondering whether that $11 million is actually not going to be for national civic education. It's actually basically to push the yes case. Already the Australian Local Government Association has gotten plenty of money doled out from it for the federal government over the past few years, which funnily enough might find its way into the yes case. This is a big push by the federal government. I'm very concerned that this may actually just be a very dodgy way of pushing the cause without giving the equivalent support for the no case. Now,
this is an interesting story because it's just been bubbling along under the surface, and to most of us it's just, should local government be recognised in the Constitution? Well, I suppose local government's there, Constitution's there, put one in the other, but you think there's more to it than that?
Well, I think it's a massive power grab by Canberra to take control, because we've seen what's happened in particular with state governments. When federal government gives them money, they give them tied grants. When they're given tied grants, they dictate the terms of what can happen. So what you're actually going to see is the country going from the country governed from local communities up to Canberra down. It's extremely dangerous, and you can see this has always been a plan of the Labor Party. They fought for it in '74, they fought for it in '88. Both times it was rejected by the Australian people. This time it's been put up very subtly, so no one's really paying much attention. But I think when the public becomes aware of the huge consequences of it, they're going to fight back.
But that's just about educating people in terms of a referendum on this. I mean, the government's got to actually whether it's yes and no, but actually lay out.
Well, they gave $40 million to the
situation.
AUC to run the referendum itself proper. What a national civics education campaign is, to me, sounds very much like a yes case. Oh, you've heard of local government, haven't you? Well, there's this proposition. Your government's very important. To put it into the Constitution, I'll just leave it there. I mean, that's basically a backdoor yes.
So those
case.
are a couple of things that were and weren't in the budget. What about you, Lenore? Was there anything that was either notable because of its omission or something that stood out as perhaps requiring a bit more of our attention?
Oh, well, I thought ABC News and Current Affairs did pretty well with some extra funding. But just on the local government issue, I'm not sure that it's quite as dastardly as Tim is making out what the proposition. You know, I think there was a High Court case which threw into some doubt arrangements that have existed under the previous coalition government and under this government and probably under many governments before then, that the federal government direct funds things into local governments, some of them very worthy things like roads, some of them things that I would find a bit more questionable, like sort of small community grants and things that I don't think the federal government should really be getting involved in. And I think one of the reasons for the constitutional change is to put beyond doubt that the federal government can fund roads and other services like that. And I find it kind of...
We actually know they can through state governments. It's just that they don't want to send it through state governments because they don't want the scrutiny attached to it.
Well, what I was trying to say is I thought that the big commission of audit that the coalition was going to have after the election was to try to remove different tiers of government from things and do things more efficiently. And maybe there are some things that it's quite responsible and proper for the federal government to fund directly to local governments without the state governments getting too involved in the middle.
Only if you don't want
accountability.
Be efficient.
Well,
only if you don't want accountability.
It sounds like this is going to be an interesting debate if it happens between now and the election, although I suspect you could be right, it could get rather subsumed in everything else. Let's stay in Canberra for the time being. The Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, was fighting back tears today as she introduced legislation for the Disability Care Levy into Parliament. In last night's budget, the number of disabled people expected to be covered by this scheme was revised upward by 50,000 to 460,000. The Prime Minister described it as a mighty force for good.
The people who have gathered here today from around the country to witness this debate know what this means. There will be no more in principle and no more when circumstances permit.
That's right.
There will be launches, not trials, permanent care, not temporary help.
Yeah.
Disability care starts in 7 weeks' time and there will be no turning back. I commend this bill to the House.
But despite bipartisan support and an opposition commitment to see the levy pass into law before this Parliament rises, the chamber was conspicuously empty this morning. Have a look. Particularly on the shadow benches, you'd have to say, on the left, but plenty of empty seats on the government side of the House as well for such an historic moment. Some reporters and commentators also applied some pretty cynical motives to the show of emotion that concluded the Prime Minister's speech there. Some of them saying that this was the result of stress and a torrid 24 hours leading up to a disastrous budget. What do you think, Cate, of some of the reaction to that? I mean, first, I guess, it was a busy day, lots of media interviews to do and so on, but for something as monumental as disability care, to have a chamber as empty as that, a bit of shame.
Yeah, it is a bit of a shame. Usually when you know that something significant's coming up in the Parliament, you tend to have at least a few members there to be present. And, yeah, so that was disappointing. But in terms of the commentary about whether, the Prime Minister was stressed, actually, tears about a disastrous budget, I mean, she's had a pretty stressful few years as Prime Minister, and for her to break down now as a result of stress, I don't think that's the case. I do know she told personal stories during that speech about people, a young girl, I think, with cerebral palsy, and really heart-wrenching stories. And I know that when you talk about personal stories, sometimes in public situations like that, it is really emotional, and you do actually really feel it. I have no doubt that her tears were genuine. I think she looked, she did come across incredibly upset, like she was trying to fight, actually breaking down. And I didn't feel for her, but not in that way. But I thought, yeah, it was very genuine, and I think she. I think it's an incredibly significant reform, and people do feel very strongly about this, and she has every right to feel strongly about it, and she has every right to show her emotions about it.
Tim, what did you think of the show of emotion and also the reaction to it?
Well, it's interesting. I think the reaction to it has been mixed. I was talking to an ABC employee who will remain nameless, who actually specifically, when I said, what do you think of it, and their response was that they didn't think it was as genuine or as honest as perhaps it was being portrayed. But I think, we need to get past these ideas about whether it's honest or not. I mean, the simple reality is I don't dispute that anybody genuinely cares for people with a disability and the importance of it. But with relation to the lack of the opposition being there, I think this I agree with Cate that normally if, there's something that's considered a historic moment and everything else, then you're likely to turn up. But this particular policy lacks a sense of historic moment about it because so much of it is about how they signed the deal up with the states and getting their participation. And yes, they've got their participation, but also about that commitment of how you're going to finance it into the long term. So I don't think it's quite the key historical moment that I think the Prime Minister might have liked to have made it out to be in practice. But for her and for her Prime Ministership, since this may be one of the only things that survives if there's a change of government and the opposition seeks to repeal things, if they're in government, I could understand why that would be.
Lenore, what's your view on this? Are these things that are sort of come out of a party room strategy? Oh, we'll only have a sprinkling of people on the opposition benches, or is it just a matter of, hey, it was budget night the night before, everyone was up late, it was a fairly early morning kind of a sitting?
Yeah, I think the opposition leader, for instance, I think was doing a media interview at the time. There's a lot on their plates at the moment. It may well have been a strategy, but I don't know that we need to read too much into it. I do find the reaction, though, to the Prime Minister crying, I don't know, a bit rich, really. I think the Prime Minister and the opposition leader are genuinely committed to this reform, and I think anybody who spends much time looking at the people who will benefit from it can't help but get a bit emotional. And it's kind of interesting because we always, criticise leaders, and particularly the Prime Minister, for being too wooden and for not being real. And then when they show some emotion, we criticise them and we're cynical about that too. Maybe we should just take it at face value that it was an emotional matter and, and she choked up a bit on it.
What about the claims, though, of whether the emotion was genuine or not, Lenore? Does that speak to a wider issue that there are just a sizable number of people that doubt the sincerity of this Prime Minister?
Well, I think there are many people who doubt her sincerity, but I don't think it's fair or justified on this issue. I think anybody looking at it could see she was genuinely upset, and I do think, as observers of politics, we need to think through the ramifications of reacting cynically in every case. So remember the Prime Minister on Q&A the other week when the high school students were asking her questions, and she said, she couldn't really show herself, she couldn't show any weakness because, she would be attacked politically. Well, is there any wonder then that we often feel like our politicians aren't real people, that we don't see real and rounded people, if any sign of emotion is perceived in that way? I think we need to think through the way we react to these things and sometimes just take them on face value. She got upset.
All right. Well, the Coalition has taken aim at the budget's forecast for revenue from the carbon tax. Previous budgets predicted a carbon price of $29 a tonne for 2015-16. That's when Australia's market-based trading scheme is supposed to link up with the European system. But that forecast has now been slashed to just over $12 a tonne as a price. A shortfall in revenue from the carbon tax this year, of course, has already forced the government to delay some promised tax cuts. Here's some of the action from Question Time this afternoon.
How can the government carbon tax projections in the budget be believed over the next 4 years when the government's carbon tax projections over the last 10 months were overstated by 500%?
We don't apologise for a second for having a market-based price and reducing carbon pollution in our society. And I said so in my speech last night. And we will continue and proceed with our carbon pricing regime because it is driving investment in alternative energy.
Meanwhile, the Greens aren't too happy with cuts to renewable energy programs in the budget.
Now, last night Labor stripped money from the renewable energy programs, particularly from ARENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, and also from a program, Low Carbon Communities, which is designed to provide energy efficiency to low-income households to enable them to bring down power bills.
Cate Fairman, from your perspective, what's wrong with trimming back these programs? There are a lot of cuts across a lot of areas in this budget.
We're just not doing enough to drive investment in renewable energy. We're not doing enough to ensure that households are doing everything they can, as Christine just said, to reduce their energy bills, to save energy. I think when we look at where we're having to go, I mean, the Treasurer last night talked about, used the words dangerous climate change in his speech. When we look at the fact that we need to be, you know, the parts per million, for example, that the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, 550 is what they're looking at. We are tracking way past that. So this budget, by cutting investments in renewable energy, by actually, you know, cutting programs for households to reduce their energy use, is not kind of keeping in line with that.
Tim, on the question of the carbon price, a significant revision from $29 to $12 a tonne. What are the implications of that?
Well, this is just more data from Peter Pan from the Commonwealth Treasury Neverland. The implications from it are clearly that it's going to reduce the amount of government revenue, but even these numbers can't realistically be believed, because by linking our emissions trading scheme post-2015 to Europe's, we've essentially outsourced control of this price, which is what we've seen, why everybody talks about, you know, the price is now around $3 in Europe, as that's where Australia's price will be, because their scheme massively overwhelms ours once we've linked and always become cheaper to buy permits there. We have no idea what the carbon price is going to be in 2015, 2016 or 2016, 2017, where the government's actually projected it goes up to about $18. This is just fantasy stuff, but what it will mean is that unless there is a very significant increase, it's not going to deliver any of the so-called benefits the government claims. The argument that it's driving renewable energy investment is just false. The only thing that's, I mean, even Greenpeace, you know, and I'm not somebody who agrees with Greenpeace very often, has even conceded that in Europe the main driver for renewable energy investment is their mandatory renewable energy target, like the one we have here. It's not a carbon price unless you get up into the many hundreds of dollars to provide investment security.
OK. Well, let's get some more reaction to last night's budget. Joining us now from Canberra is the Finance Minister, Senator Penny Wong. Penny Wong, welcome to the drum.
Good to be with you all.
Now, first of all, the comments a little earlier today from Wayne Swan, not surprisingly to some, perhaps saying that while it was economically the right thing to do to forecast a surplus that, as it turned out, wasn't met, it was perhaps politically not the right thing to do. In light of that, last night's budget, was it, do you think, better politically or economically?
I think it was the right budget for the future of the country, and what we tried to do was to look at the circumstances we confronted, which was the second largest hit to revenue since the Great Depression, and say, well, what's the right economic choice here? How do we continue to ensure we have a low rate of unemployment and we have economic growth? And we also, despite these circumstances, have to find the room to fund really important reforms like disability care, such an important reform for Australians with a significant and permanent disability, and of course the schools reform, which is about lifting all our classrooms. So that was the approach we took when putting the budget together. And
tell us about that process itself. How do you start when you know it's a budget where you have to find a lot of savings? Is it just a matter of saying, well, what's going to be give us the best return for those dollars? How do you make those calls? Well,
I think there's sort of two sides to the budget. The first was the revenue side, and of course we anticipated less tax than we'd previously estimated, and that's why we wrote down revenue in the mid-year review last year, some 6 months ago. But regrettably, what we've seen then is an even lower rate of tax as a share of the economy coming to government. So those numbers regrettably got worse through the budget process. That made the savings task harder. But what you do is you look at what are the key priorities that a government has for the nation. Ultimately, like elections, budgets are about choices. They're about choices as to what your future should look like. They're choices about what your priorities for the nation are. That's what budgets are about.
In a political sense, though, is it fair to say that traditionally budgets in election years are all about sort of saving a little bit so that you do have that ability to give a nice, sweet budget to remind people of just what a terrific government you are, and that really has gone horribly wrong?
It depends what you think right and wrong are. I think the right thing is to make the right choices and to say these are the choices that deliver a better future for this country. And, you know, I'm happy to have a discussion about those choices. I mean, you're right to say it's not your traditional election year budget. There aren't a lot of giveaways, as you described. But I think that the giveaway is economic growth, you know, an unemployment rate where it is. Remember, 960,000 jobs created since we came to government, and the room for the big reforms that really make a difference and will make a difference to Australians. You know, reforming our schools, making sure children are not left behind as they are under our current system, and of course disability care.
Got a question for you from Tim Wilson.
Penny, you asked, in the budget last night there was $11 million allocated towards running a national civics education campaign on the local government referendum, and I just want a sort of concrete guarantee that that money is going to be used not to run a de facto yes case on behalf of the federal government to change the constitution.
Well, I have to say that's not the question I expected you to ask me to.
I could ask you about the carbon tax as well. Don't you answer this one?
Yeah, and you and I have had a few conversations about that. And we could talk about some of the savings measures you would prefer to see as well, I'm sure. But look, you know, my recollection, and I'm sorry, you'd have to probably talk to Anthony Albanese because he's the minister responsible for that, is whenever there's a referendum, there is funding for both a yes and a no case. If there's funding for ALGA, that is a matter for them, you know, how they want to engage with this process. But I'm sorry, you probably have to talk to the relevant minister on the details of that, those arrangements.
But just quickly though, you'd be happy if it was actually there was funding going to both sides rather than just being for the yes case.
Well, Tim, I think you always have to fund in a referendum a yes and a no case. That's how those conventions work. But as I said, in terms of the ALGA grant, the local government grant, which I think might be a separate issue, you'd probably need to talk to Anthony.
OK, let's ask a question that is perhaps a little more relevant to this particular Minister, Cate Fairman.
Minister, I understand that the G20 is looking at removing fossil fuel subsidies over, you know, a period of years, and I'm just wondering why in this budget, given the kind of revenue shortfall, why the government didn't look, for example, at the diesel fuel rebate for the mining industry, which I understand is about $2 billion a year. Just wondering what the thinking is there.
Well, the thinking, Cate, is, and I'm sorry, we're not going to agree on these issues.
I'm sure we're not.
No, we're not, because we don't believe that simply jacking up taxes on industry over and over again is a sensible way to run an economy.
But this is removing a subsidy, though.
What we do believe is in pricing carbon. We tried to do that once. You voted with Tony Abbott to stop that happening, and now we finally have a carbon price. We think that's the most effective way to reduce pollution, and we also are in this budget continuing to fund renewable energy. It's not correct to say we're not. We have had to make some savings decisions there, just as we've had to make in the area of CCS and other areas of the budget, given the budget position.
Penny Wong, given that I suppose most Australians in their busy lives, they don't look at specific details of a budget, just perhaps something that may affect them directly at some point. What do you hope is the kind of the meme that comes out of this budget? What is the takeaway? Best case scenario, given that it's a tough budget to have to deliver 4 months out from an election, you had to make some very tough choices, as you say. What would you like that final impression to be of it?
This is a budget for the future. And I'm very happy to have a contest about what the future plans for the nation are with the opposition. I think the difficulty at the moment is you have one political party, the Labor government, laying out our plan for the future, saying, look, we want a stronger nation but also a smarter and a fairer nation. That's why schools and disability are so important, and these are the choices we've made to fund those priorities. Well, tomorrow Tony Abbott does his budget reply. I reckon it'd be a good thing if you let Australians in on whatever his plans are, because he certainly hasn't told them till now.
And that's sounding not just like a theme for Budget Week, but a theme for the next 4 months as well.
Oh, well, you know, I just think I think Australians are entitled to know what your plans are for the future of the country. They are entitled to know that, and at some point I think Tony's actually got to tell people.
Senator, before I let you go, the scenes that have created a bit of comment today, the Prime Minister announcing the legislation for the funding of the disability care program becoming emotional. Some said that was stress. It's all about the budget. What was your sense?
Oh, no, not at all. I think you forget sometimes in these cynical times that we come into politics to try and do good things, and as Labor people, you know, the party that built Medicare, this has been a reform we've worked on for years. And the Prime Minister, as she moves around the country, talks to people for whom this makes such a big difference. And I think all of us are moved in these jobs when you get the opportunity to actually deliver something of such significance to people who deserve it and who are in need. And that is a very moving, a profoundly moving thing. And that's how I read the Prime Minister today.
The Prime Minister has also said in the past that she tries not to show emotion, to show that things are getting to her. Is it harder, do you think? Does it come down to the whole female Prime Minister thing, that it is more difficult, more important to show steely control?
Oh, look, I don't know if, you know, we've got, is Lenore on the program? Did we analyse Bob Hawke's tears? I mean, as much as these seem to be analysed, I think there's a very simple explanation. This is a really big reform, and it's going to mean a lot to people who we've met with, that we've been engaging with, and the Prime Minister and Jenny Macklin in particular. And when you're touched by that, and therefore moved by what this means, I think that's just a human response. It's not about gender.
And is there anything that can be done in the next 4 months to overcome the fact that it seems a significant number of people see Julia Gillard in tears and they say she's faking it?
Well, you can't help how people will react. You just have to do what's right, and that's what the Prime Minister's done in this budget, and that's what she's done on disability care, and that's what she did today when she introduced the legislation.
Well, Penny Wong, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us from Canberra tonight.
Good to speak with you.
Well, also in last night's budget, the federal government announced a review to determine whether Australia is accepting more people as refugees than other nations are. Australia currently accepts around 20,000 refugees a year. That number increased by 6,000 last year, in line with recommendations from that expert panel. The opposition has promised to return to the lower intake level to, it says, discourage people smugglers. Over the past 15 years, though, between 70 and up to 99% of onshore asylum seekers have been granted refugee status to stay in Australia. The Prime Minister says this review will look at what is an appropriate number and how that compares internationally.
There's a question here, which is if acceptance rates around the world are different to Australian acceptance rates, why is that so? We want the Refugee Status Determination Review to address that question.
Lenore Taylor in Canberra, I'll bring you here on this. I mean, it's hard to quite figure out what they're looking to discover here. Is it just so they can compare whether we're applying a different measure to what makes a refugee from asylum seekers as opposed to other countries?
Yes, so they're not looking, the review isn't looking at how many refugees we take, but rather the criteria by which we judge whether people are refugees or not. I find it interesting that they're having it. I mean, the determination levels have been high. You know, a very high proportion of applicants have been found to be genuine refugees, but governments under the Howard government and under the Labor governments have been cracking down on this procedure and on rights of review over many, many years. So what more can be done? I'm not really sure. I think this is obviously an enormous problem for Labor, and if the Coalition wins on September 14, it's going to be an enormous, probably even a bigger problem for the Coalition, because they've made such a thing of stopping the boats. And, you know, when you look at the policies of the two major parties now, they're not all that much different. They both have offshore processing. They both have some provision to release people into the community once they're found to be refugees, or now also on bridging visas while they're being processed. Under Labor, those people aren't allowed to work. Under the Coalition, they would be allowed to work. The only real difference is the turning back the boats, and that is fraught and potentially risky. So I think for both sides of politics, this is an issue which is costly, which is really fraught and difficult, and it'll be really interesting to see how an incoming Coalition government, if they win, will deal with it, as well as how this review will pan out.
And Lenore, what of the question of how relevant an international comparison might be anyway, given that Australia, I understand, has a higher rate of asylum seeker to refugees than other countries where people arrive under different circumstances, maybe haven't had to get on a leaky boat and travel halfway around the world and so on. Is it going to tell us anything?
Well, you can't obviously compare the raw numbers. You have to compare how people are assessed and under what criteria. And if those criteria are fair and reasonable and justified under our international obligations, then the result is what the result is. You can't you can't kind of create the result that you want. You have to apply the benchmarks. And I guess it's fine to have another look at our benchmarks and see if they're in line with what happens overseas. But if it happens that they turn up a higher proportion of refugees here than elsewhere, then that might be because we have a higher proportion of genuine refugees turning up and making claims.
Cate, is there any potential downside to this? Are you seeing any sinister motives?
Well, yeah, I do feel that there's sinister motives. I mean, if we're assessing people now, and the approximate number is around 90% of all people who are seeking asylum are found to be genuine refugees, I can't see the government thinking, oh, well, that's a problem. We're not finding enough of these people are genuine refugees. Surely they're thinking the other way in terms of how many, not huge numbers, but just the increase now in people seeking asylum. So it's almost like this is their last desperate measure. If we can look at how some other countries are doing it that potentially have a lower success rate, it's a lower determination rate, and see how they're determining them, then we can send them back to, we know they've been sent back to Sri Lanka, for example, but like people who come from Iraq, Afghanistan, I mean, largely they're persecuted minorities and they are definitely, almost always found to be genuine refugees. So it is a bit of a worry, yes, that they're undertaking this research. I'm not sure of the motive.
Tim, do you see any benefit in standardising it? Obviously the United Nations has a definition, a way of defining what a refugee is. Do we need to go any further into it?
Well, there's obviously some...
can get some pot from their doctor.
Well, look, the parliamentary inquiry with, Liberal, Labor, Shooters and Fishers, the Greens, all looked at this and came up with this recommendation. You can be guaranteed if they thought there was a thin edge of the wedge, they wouldn't have. So now it's up to political support. Despite this committee finding it, I doubt that we're going to get this political support from Barry O'Farrell.
All right then, just quickly, Tim.
Clearly people are already using these drugs illegally, and so this raises other issues about whether we're treating it as a crime versus health.
Do you think we'll see any progress on this in Canberra, Lenore?
Well, I mean, I just always think those thin end of the wedge arguments are a bit spurious because, it's not like the politicians don't have control over any other steps that happen afterwards. If this is a first step, it's
Lenore,
a first step.
We're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us from Canberra, Lenore Taylor, as well as Cate Fairman and Tim Wilson. You can check out The Drum online at abc.net.au/The Drum. Hope to see you at the same time tomorrow. Bye for now.
Subjective nature to how you interpret those individual definitions, though, and I think that's what it's ultimately looking at. And I don't share the sort of cynicism about just how dire this could be. We should need to make sure the program has integrity, if for no other reason than because Australian people need to have confidence with it, but also because the people who should come in here who are under asylum, who are refugees, should be because they're genuine refugees. That's essential for the integrity of the program, but it's also essential to make sure that we're getting the right people coming in for those who are desperately in need. It's fair enough.
We're just about out of time, but a quick final question for each of you. The people of New South Wales could be one step closer to using marijuana legally, or at least dying people in New South Wales may be one step closer today. A parliamentary committee in the state has recommended allowing the terminally ill and those living with AIDS to take the drug to be able to relieve their symptoms of various illnesses, their pain, also to increase their appetite, up to 15 grams of dry cannabis. Now, Cate Fairman, on this, some would say this is the thin edge of the wedge. In the United States, they said, yep, we'll give it to the terminally ill, and then suddenly anybody with a vague anxiety disorder can get some pot from their doctor.
Well, look, the parliamentary inquiry with, Liberal, Labor, Shooters and Fishers, the Greens, all looked at this and came up with this recommendation. You can be guaranteed if they thought there was a thin edge of the wedge, they wouldn't have. So now it's up to political support. Despite this committee finding it, I doubt that we're going to get this political support from Barry O'Farrell.
All right then, just quickly, Tim.
Clearly people are already using these drugs illegally, and so this raises other issues about whether we're treating it as a crime versus health.
Do you think we'll see any progress on this in Canberra, Lenore?
Oh, well, I mean, I just always think those thin end of the wedge arguments are a bit spurious because, you know, it's not like the politicians don't have control over any other steps that happen afterwards. If this is a first step, it's a first step.
We're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us from Canberra, Lenore Taylor, as well as Cate Fairman and Tim Wilson. You can check out The Drum online at abc.net.au/The Drum. Hope to see you at the same time tomorrow. Bye for now.